A child cried out to God during a fire. Minutes later, the miracle that happened left the firefighters speechless. The Evergreen Orphanage stood proudly against the backdrop of the Colorado mountains, its 3 stories of weathered red brick and white trim, a testament to over a century of sheltering children in need. The historic building, with its Victorian architecture and tall windows, had been a cornerstone of the small town of Pine Valley since 1893. As the autumn sun began its descent behind the snow-capped peaks, the warm glow filtered through the large bay windows of the 3rd floor, where 7-year-old Emma sat quietly on the window seat, her bright blue eyes focused on the worn Bible in her lap. Emma wasn't like most children her age. There was something extraordinary about her, a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from within. Her auburn hair caught the dying sunlight, creating a halo effect that made her appear almost ethereal as she read silently, her small finger tracing each line with careful precision. The other children often gravitated toward her naturally, finding comfort in her unwavering sense of peace. Miss Clara Thompson, the orphanage's head caretaker for the past 15 years, watched Emma from the doorway of the 3rd floor common room. A warm smile crossed her face as she observed the scene before her. 5 younger children, Michael, Sarah, Tommy, Lucy, and David, all between the ages of 4 and 6, sat in a semicircle around Emma's feet, listening intently as she began to read aloud from her favorite Bible story. "Miss Clara," Emma looked up, her face brightening. "Would you like to join our story time?" Her voice carried a maturity that belied her young age, yet maintained the sweet innocence of childhood. "I'd love to, sweetheart," Miss Clara replied, her grey hair neatly tucked into a bun. "But dinner preparations await. Speaking of which, I could use some help in the kitchen. Who would like to be my special assistants?" The 5 younger children jumped up excitedly, but Emma remained seated. "I'll help after I finish this chapter," she said thoughtfully. "I promised them the story of Daniel in the lion's den." Miss Clara nodded understanding. "Take your time, dear. Dinner won't be for another hour." She gathered the younger children, who followed her like eager ducklings down the grand wooden staircase to the 1st floor. The orphanage's interior was a maze of well-loved spaces, each room holding its own history. The 3rd floor housed the children's dormitories and the common room where Emma sat. The 2nd floor contained classrooms, a small library, and the staff quarters. The 1st floor was home to the kitchen, dining room, and various administrative offices. Below, the ancient basement housed the building's mechanical systems, including the aging heating unit that had been causing Miss Clara concern lately. As Emma continued reading, the autumn wind whistled through the century-old windows, creating a subtle draft that caused the heavy curtains to sway gently. The sound of children's laughter drifted up from the kitchen below, accompanied by the clatter of pots and pans. It was a normal evening at Evergreen Orphanage, filled with the comfortable routines that gave the children a sense of stability and security. In the kitchen, Miss Clara supervised as the younger children helped with simple tasks. 6-year-old Michael carefully counted out plates, while 5-year-old Sarah and 4-year-old Tommy arranged silverware. Lucy and David, both 5, stood on sturdy stools at the sink, washing vegetables under Miss Clara's watchful eye. The kitchen was the heart of the orphanage, a warm and inviting space with well-worn wooden countertops and a large cast-iron stove that had faithfully served generations of children. The walls were decorated with artwork created by current and former residents, a colorful testament to the lives that had passed through these halls. As the evening progressed, other staff members moved through their regular routines. Mrs. Bennett, the night supervisor, arrived for her shift, exchanging quiet words with Miss Clara about the day's events. Mr. Rodriguez, the maintenance man, made his final rounds, paying special attention to the temperamental heating system in the basement. Upstairs, Emma finally closed her Bible and stood, smoothing down her simple blue dress. She paused at the window, watching as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Something about the sunset caught her attention, perhaps the way the clouds seemed to gather unusually thick and dark on the horizon, or how the wind had picked up strength over the past hour. "Emma," Miss Clara's voice called from below. "We could use your help now, sweetheart." "Coming," Emma replied, carefully placing her Bible on the window seat. As she turned to leave, she hesitated for a moment, feeling a strange urge to pray. Following her instinct, she closed her eyes and whispered a quick prayer for protection, something she had never felt compelled to do before at this time of day. The old building creaked and settled around her as she made her way down the stairs, her small hand trailing along the polished wooden banister. The familiar sounds and smells of home surrounded her, the subtle scent of lemon furniture polish, the aroma of dinner beginning to waft from the kitchen, the distant hum of the heating system awakening for the evening. In the kitchen, Emma found her place among the other children, helping Miss Clara prepare the evening meal. As she worked, she hummed quietly, "Amazing Grace," her favorite hymn. The younger children soon joined in, their sweet voices filling the kitchen with melody. None of them could have known that this peaceful evening routine was about to be shattered, that their lives were about to change forever, or that Emma's extraordinary faith would soon be tested in ways no one could have imagined. For now they were simply children, safe and warm in the only home many of them had ever known, while outside, the wind continued to rise, and somewhere deep in the basement, the ancient heating system struggled against the coming cold. The sun finally disappeared behind the mountains, leaving behind a sky that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. The first stars began to appear above the Evergreen Orphanage, twinkling like distant guardians over the peaceful scene below, unaware that this ordinary evening was about to become anything but. The peaceful evening routine at Evergreen Orphanage was shattered by a sound that no one would soon forget. At precisely 7:15 in the evening, as Miss Clara was serving dinner to the children in the first-floor dining room, a deep rumble emanated from the basement. The sound was followed by a deafening explosion that shook the entire building to its foundation, causing the Victorian-era chandeliers to sway precariously and sending plates clattering to the floor. Emma, who had been helping serve milk to the younger children, immediately grabbed hold of 5-year-old Sarah, who had begun to cry. The other children, Michael, Tommy, Lucy, and David, huddled close to her instinctively, seeking the comfort they'd always found in her presence. Miss Clara's face had gone pale as she steadied herself against the dining room table. "Everyone stay calm," Miss Clara commanded, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. The acrid smell of smoke had already begun to seep through the floorboards, and the distant sound of crackling flames could be heard from below. "We need to leave the building immediately. Remember our fire drills, stay together and walk, don't run." The initial evacuation began smoothly, with Miss Clara leading the majority of the children toward the main entrance. However, as they approached the front door, a second explosion rocked the building, this one more violent than the first. The force of the blast sent a shower of sparks and burning debris up through the basement stairwell, effectively cutting off their primary escape route. Emma, who had been at the back of the group with her 5 younger charges, found herself separated from the main group by a wall of flames that had erupted through the ancient wooden flooring. The heat was intense, causing the children to stumble backward toward the grand staircase. Through the chaos, she could hear Miss Clara's desperate voice. "Emma, take the children up to the 3rd-floor fire escape. We'll meet you outside," Miss Clara shouted over the roar of the flames, her voice nearly drowned out by the sound of shattering windows and creaking timber. Without hesitation, Emma gathered her small group. "Hold hands, everyone," she instructed, her voice carrying a calmness that seemed almost supernatural in the face of such danger. "We're going upstairs together. Don't let go, no matter what happens." As they ascended the grand staircase, Emma could feel the heat intensifying behind them. The old wood groaned under their feet, and smoke began to fill the upper floors, making it increasingly difficult to breathe. Little Tommy stumbled, coughing, but 6-year-old Michael helped steady him as they continued their climb. Reaching the 3rd floor, Emma led the children toward the fire escape, only to find that the ancient metal structure had partially pulled away from the building's facade. The recent autumn storms had weakened its moorings, and the heat from the fire had caused further damage. The platform swayed precariously in the wind, clearly unsafe for 5 small children. "We'll have to find another way," Emma said, trying to keep the worry from her voice. She led the group to the common room where she had been reading her Bible just hours before. The heavy wooden door would provide some protection from the smoke and flames, and the large windows might offer another means of escape. As they entered the room, Emma quickly closed the door behind them and used her cardigan to stuff the gap at the bottom, just as she'd learned in their fire safety lessons. The children huddled together near the window seat, where her Bible still lay. She retrieved it, clutching it to her chest like a shield. "Are we going to die?" Sarah whimpered, her small face streaked with tears and soot. Emma knelt down beside her, gathering all 5 children close. "No," she said firmly, her voice filled with conviction. "God is with us, and He will protect us. We need to pray and stay together." The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. Through the window, Emma could see the first fire trucks arriving, their red lights casting an eerie glow through the thickening smoke. She watched as firefighters jumped into action, quickly assessing the situation and beginning to deploy their equipment. The heat was becoming unbearable, and the smoke was finding its way into their sanctuary, despite Emma's best efforts to block it. The building's ancient wooden structure was working against them, providing ample fuel for the flames that were now visible through the gaps in the floorboards. "Everyone sit in a circle," Emma instructed, opening her Bible with trembling hands. "We're going to pray together just like we do every night. God hasn't forgotten us." The 5 younger children formed a tight circle, their hands clasped together, as Emma began to recite Psalm 23. Her clear, young voice carried above the crackling of flames and the distant shouts of firefighters. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." Outside, Fire Chief Mark Stevens had arrived on the scene, immediately taking command of the situation. His heart nearly stopped when he learned there were still children trapped on the 3rd floor. The scenario was too familiar, painfully, horrifyingly familiar. 3 years ago, he had faced another fire, another trapped child, and that time, he had lost everything. The flames had now engulfed most of the 1st and 2nd floors, creating an impenetrable barrier of fire and smoke. The heat was so intense that it had begun to melt the firefighters' equipment, forcing them to fall back, despite their desperate desire to reach the trapped children. Inside the common room, Emma continued to lead the children in prayer, even as the smoke grew thicker and breathing became more difficult. She had torn her dress into strips, wetting them with water from a small bathroom attached to the common room, and helped the younger children cover their mouths and noses. "Remember what Daniel said in the lion's den?" Emma asked, trying to keep the children focused on her voice rather than the approaching flames. "He trusted God to protect him, and God sent an angel to shut the lions' mouths. We need to trust like Daniel did." The fire was now visible beneath the door, its orange fingers reaching through the gaps in the floorboards. The ancient wood of the Evergreen Orphanage, dried by over a century of Colorado summers, was feeding the flames with frightening efficiency. The children huddled closer together as the temperature in the room continued to rise. Outside, Chief Stevens watched in horror as the fire consumed more of the building. His men were doing everything they could, but the intensity of the blaze, combined with the building's age and construction, was making their efforts futile. The image of another fire, another child, his own daughter, flashed through his mind, threatening to paralyze him with grief and fear. But then, through the roar of the flames and the chaos of the scene, he heard something that made his heart stop. A child's voice, clear and strong, was singing. The sound seemed to float above the destruction, carrying with it a peace that defied explanation. Inside the common room, Emma had begun to sing the hymn she had been humming earlier in the kitchen. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." Her voice, though trembling slightly, remained strong and true. One by one, the other children joined in, their young voices creating a chorus of hope in the midst of despair. As the flames drew closer and the smoke thickened, Emma pulled the children tighter together, continuing to sing even as tears streamed down her face. She knew that help was outside, but she also knew that the situation was desperate. Yet somehow, deep in her heart, she felt a certainty that transcended the terrible reality of their circumstances. The night was far from over, and the true miracle was yet to come. But in that moment, as 6 children huddled together in prayer and song, surrounded by an inferno that threatened to consume everything in its path, something extraordinary was already taking place, a demonstration of faith that would touch hearts and change lives forever. Fire Chief Mark Stevens stood before the inferno that was consuming the Evergreen Orphanage, his heart pounding against his chest as the memories he'd fought so hard to suppress came rushing back. The wail of sirens filled the air as 3 more fire trucks arrived on scene, their red lights painting the growing crowd of onlookers in an otherworldly glow. The historic 3-story building, once a testament to the town's commitment to its most vulnerable children, was now transformed into a tower of flames against the darkening Colorado sky. "Chief!" Lieutenant Rodriguez called out, running toward him with an update. "We've confirmed 6 children trapped on the 3rd floor, 1 7-year-old and 5 younger ones. Miss Clara says they're in the common room, but the main stairwell has completely collapsed." Stevens nodded grimly, his experienced eyes scanning the building's facade. The intense heat had already caused several windows to shatter, sending shards of century-old glass raining down onto the pavement below. The fire escape, their best hope for an external rescue, hung precariously from its moorings, rendered useless by years of exposure to harsh mountain weather. "Get the aerial ladder in position," Stevens commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. "And I want thermal imaging on that third floor now. We need to know exactly where those kids are." As his team rushed to follow his orders, Stevens found himself transported back 3 years to another fire that had forever changed his life. His daughter, Sarah, had been just 6 years old, the same age as some of the children trapped above. He could still hear her frightened voice calling out to him as the flames consumed their home, could still feel the desperate helplessness as he realized he couldn't reach her in time. "Chief, the thermal readings are coming in." Lieutenant Rodriguez's voice snapped him back to the present. "We've got 6 distinct heat signatures clustered together in the northeast corner of the building. They're alive, but the floor temperature is rising rapidly." Stevens studied the thermal imaging screen, his trained eye noting the structural weak points where the fire was eating away at the building's wooden skeleton. The children had unknowingly chosen the best possible location. The common room's thick wooden doors and stone fireplace were temporarily shielding them from the worst of the blaze, but it wouldn't last long. "Get 2 teams ready," he ordered, pulling his protective gear tighter. "We'll attempt entry through the west window while the aerial ladder approaches from the east. If we can't reach them from either direction..." He left the sentence unfinished, unwilling to voice the devastating alternative. The rumble of diesel engines filled the air as the ladder truck maneuvered into position. Above, the flames had begun to breach the third-floor windows, sending thick black smoke billowing into the night sky. The crowd of spectators had grown larger, their murmured prayers and worried conversations creating a somber backdrop to the emergency response. Miss Clara approached Stevens, her normally composed demeanor cracking under the weight of fear. "Chief Stevens, the girl up there, Emma, she's special. She has a faith unlike anything I've ever seen. If anyone can keep those children calm in this situation, it's her." Stevens felt his throat tighten. Faith. He'd had faith once before the fire that took his Sarah, before he'd watched helplessly as his world burned to ashes, before he'd turned his back on a God who could allow such tragedy to befall an innocent child. "Faith won't stop these flames, ma'am," he replied more harshly than he'd intended. "We need water, equipment, and a miracle right now." The sound of cracking timber interrupted their conversation as another section of the building's roof collapsed inward. Sparks shot skyward like a geyser of fire, forcing the firefighters to retreat several steps. The heat was becoming unbearable, even from their position on the ground. "Sir," a young firefighter called out, "the aerial ladder can't get close enough. The heat's too intense. It's melting the hydraulic lines." Stevens felt his heart sink as he watched their best chance of rescue literally melt away. The fire had created its own weather system, generating winds that whipped the flames into an even greater frenzy. The historic orphanage was becoming a funeral pyre before their eyes. Through the roar of the inferno, Stevens suddenly heard something that made his blood run cold, a child's voice singing. The sound floated down from the third floor, carrying clearly despite the chaos. It reminded him so much of Sarah that for a moment he couldn't breathe. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The singing grew stronger as other young voices joined in, their harmony creating a surreal counterpoint to the destruction around them. Stevens found himself frozen, memories of his daughter's voice merging with the present reality in a way that threatened to overwhelm him. "Chief!" Lieutenant Rodriguez's urgent voice broke through his paralysis. "We need to make a decision now. That floor won't hold much longer." Stevens squared his shoulders, pushing back against the weight of his memories. These children needed him now, just as Sarah had needed him then. This time he wouldn't fail. He couldn't fail. "Get me every available hose focused on that third floor," he commanded. "If we can't reach them, we'll at least buy them time. And get me Engine 4's equipment. I'm going up." His team looked at him with concern. They all knew his history, knew the demons he carried. But they also recognized the determination in his voice, the voice of a man who had faced his worst nightmare and was choosing to run toward it again. As Stevens began checking his gear, he heard Miss Clara speaking softly behind him. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Chief Stevens. Perhaps he brought you here tonight for a reason." Stevens didn't respond, but her words echoed in his mind as he prepared to face the inferno. The singing from above continued, a haunting reminder of all he had lost and everything that was at stake. 6 young lives hung in the balance, their fate resting in his hands and the hands of his crew. The next few minutes would determine whether history would repeat itself, or if this time, faith and determination could overcome the seemingly impossible odds. As Stevens secured his breathing apparatus and approached the building, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in 3 years. He prayed. It wasn't a formal prayer, just a desperate whisper carried away by the heat and smoke. "Please, not again. Not these children. Not tonight." The inferno roared in response, as if challenging his resolve. But somewhere above, Emma's voice continued to sing, carrying with it a hope that defied the darkness closing in around them. The real battle was about to begin, and Mark Stevens was about to face not just the flames, but the ghosts of his past that had haunted him for so long. In the smoke-filled common room of the third floor, Emma tightened her grip on the younger children's hands as the heat continued to intensify. The wet cloth strips she had torn from her dress were providing less and less protection from the thickening smoke. Through the windows, she could see the orange glow of flames reflecting off the dark clouds above, creating an apocalyptic scene that would have terrified most adults, let alone children. "Everyone stay close," Emma instructed, her voice remaining remarkably steady. "Sarah, are you still with us?" She reached out to touch the youngest child's face, making sure the 5-year-old was still conscious. "I'm scared, Emma," Sarah whimpered, her voice muffled by the damp cloth covering her mouth. "It's getting so hot." The other children, Michael, Tommy, Lucy, and David, huddled closer together. The temperature in the room had become almost unbearable, and the ancient wooden floorboards beneath them groaned ominously with each passing minute. The fire's roar had grown so loud that they could barely hear each other speak. "Remember what we read today?" Emma asked, trying to keep their minds focused on something other than their dire situation. "About Daniel in the lion's den. He wasn't alone, and neither are we. God sent an angel to protect Daniel, and he's watching over us too." As if to challenge her words, a loud crack echoed through the room as one of the ceiling beams shifted. Sparks began to filter through the gaps in the ceiling, dancing in the smoky air like deadly fireflies. Emma knew they needed to move away from that section of the room, but their options were becoming increasingly limited. "Let's move closer to the window," she suggested, carefully guiding the group toward the large bay window where she had been reading her Bible earlier that evening. The sacred book was still clutched tightly in her free hand, a tangible reminder of the faith she was clinging to. Outside, they could hear the shouts of firefighters and the mechanical whine of equipment. Emma watched as another attempt to reach them with the aerial ladder failed, the intense heat forcing the rescuers to retreat once again. She could see Fire Chief Stevens on the ground, his movements becoming increasingly desperate as each rescue attempt was thwarted. "Let's pray together," Emma said, gathering the children into a tight circle. "But this time, let's pray for the firefighters too. They're trying so hard to save us." The 6 children formed a circle, their small hands clasped together despite the sweat making their palms slick. Emma began to pray, her clear voice rising above the chaos surrounding them. "Dear God, please protect us and the brave firefighters who are trying to help. Give them strength and wisdom. Help them find a way to reach us, and please keep us safe like you kept Daniel safe. We trust in you even now, especially now." As she finished her prayer, Emma felt a strange calm settle over her. Despite the dire circumstances, she looked at each of the younger children's faces, seeing fear but also trust in their eyes. They were following her lead, drawing strength from her unwavering faith. "Now let's sing," she suggested, remembering how singing had always helped calm the younger children during thunderstorms. "Amazing Grace," all together now. Their young voices joined in harmony, creating an almost supernatural contrast to the inferno raging around them. The hymn rose above the crackling flames and crashing timber, carrying through the broken windows to the gathered crowd below. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." Below, Fire Chief Mark Stevens felt his heart constrict as the children's voices reached him. The sound penetrated the hardened shell he had built around his emotions since losing his daughter. The pure faith in those young voices struck a chord that he had thought long dead within him. Inside the room, Emma continued leading the song, even as the smoke grew thicker and breathing became more difficult. Between verses, she checked on each child, making sure they were all still conscious and focused on her voice rather than their fear. "The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be, as long as life endures." The heat was becoming unbearable. The children's faces were streaked with soot and tears, their clothes damp with sweat. The fire had now reached the hallway outside their room, and flames were visible beneath the door. The ancient wooden floor beneath them was growing hotter by the minute. "Emma," Michael coughed, his 6-year-old face pale beneath the soot. "I can't breathe very well." Emma quickly re-wet the cloth covering his mouth using the last of their water. "Just keep singing," she encouraged. "Focus on the words, not the smoke." As they continued singing, Emma noticed something strange. Despite the intense heat and smoke, she felt an unusual sense of peace. It wasn't resignation or despair, but rather a profound certainty that they weren't alone in that room. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a presence, protective, powerful, and peaceful. "Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." The flames were now visible through cracks in the floorboards, casting an eerie glow across the children's faces. The heat had become so intense that the paint on the walls was beginning to bubble and peel. Yet still they sang, their young voices growing hoarse but never wavering. Emma kept one eye on the door and another on the window, knowing their time was running out. The fire escape was clearly unusable, and the aerial ladder couldn't reach them. Their only hope now lay in their faith and the determined firefighters below. "When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun." As they finished the hymn, Emma heard a new sound above the roar of the flames. Chief Stephen's voice, calling out to them from somewhere below. She led the children in another round of singing, making sure their voices could be heard, guiding their rescuers to their location. The floor beneath them groaned again, more ominously this time. Emma knew they couldn't stay where they were much longer, but moving risked crossing weakened floorboards that might give way. She gathered the children even closer, forming a tight circle of prayer and song. "God is with us," she assured them, her voice firm despite her growing exhaustion. "He hasn't brought us this far to leave us now. Keep praying, keep singing, and don't lose faith." As the flames drew closer and the smoke grew thicker, Emma's faith remained unshaken. Something told her that their story wasn't going to end in that room, that there was still hope, still a purpose to all of this, and so they continued to sing and pray. 6 young voices united in faith, waiting for the miracle they believed would come. As the inferno raged around them, Emma felt a divine inspiration that would later be described as the turning point of that fateful night. The air had become almost unbreathable, and the 5 younger children were struggling to stay conscious. Looking at their soot-stained faces, Emma knew they needed something more powerful than just another prayer. Drawing from the deepest well of her faith, she began to sing a different hymn, one that seemed to flow through her from somewhere beyond herself. "Be still, my soul, the Lord is on thy side. Bear patiently the cross of grief or pain. Leave to thy God to order and provide in every change. He faithful will remain." Her voice, though young, carried a strength and clarity that seemed to cut through the roar of the flames. One by one, the other children began to join in, their voices creating a harmony that defied the chaos surrounding them. Even little Sarah, who had been whimpering softly, found the strength to add her voice to the chorus. Below, Fire Chief Mark Stevens froze in his tracks. The hymn pierced through his hardened exterior, striking a chord deep within his soul. It was the same hymn that had been sung at his daughter's funeral 3 years ago. But now, instead of bringing pain, the sound filled him with an inexplicable sense of purpose. "Everyone, hold positions," he commanded into his radio, his voice tight with emotion. "Listen." The firefighters paused in their desperate efforts, and for a moment, the only sounds were the crackling of flames and the pure, clear voices of the children floating down from above. The gathered crowd fell silent, many bowing their heads in prayer as the haunting melody continued. "Be still, my soul, thy best, thy heavenly friend through thorny ways leads to a joyful end." Lieutenant Rodriguez approached Stevens, his face etched with concern beneath his protective gear. "Chief, the structural engineer says we've got less than 15 minutes before total collapse. We need to make a decision now." Stevens stared up at the third-floor windows, where orange flames danced behind the glass. The children's voices seemed to be calling directly to him, challenging him to face his deepest fears. In his mind's eye, he saw his daughter Sarah, her face overlapping with the image of young Emma and the other children trapped above. "Get every available hose on that building," he ordered, a new determination in his voice. "Focus on the northeast corner. We're going in." As the firefighters rushed to reposition their equipment, something extraordinary began to happen. The children's voices grew stronger, more unified, as if drawing power from an unseen source. Emma, feeling a presence she couldn't explain, led them into another verse. "Be still, my soul. Thy God doth undertake to guide the future as he has the past. Thy hope, thy confidence, let nothing shake. All now mysterious shall be bright at last." The hymn seemed to take on a life of its own, resonating through the smoke-filled air with an almost tangible force. Those watching from below would later swear they saw a soft golden light beginning to emanate from the third-floor windows, distinct from the orange glow of the flames. Inside the room, Emma felt a cool breeze brush against her face, despite the suffocating heat. The younger children, who had been struggling to breathe moments before, suddenly found their voices growing stronger. The smoke, which had been thick enough to choke them, appeared to be thinning around their huddled circle. "Be still, my soul. The waves and winds still know his voice, who ruled them while he dwelt below." As the verse ended, a sudden gust of wind swept through the area, causing the flames to dance and shift. The firefighters watched in amazement as a path began to clear through the smoke, creating what appeared to be a corridor of clearer air leading straight to the third-floor window. Chief Stevens, his heart pounding, recognized the opportunity that had seemingly been handed to them. "This is our chance," he shouted. "Get that ladder up now." The aerial ladder, which had been repeatedly driven back by the intense heat, was quickly repositioned. This time, instead of being forced to retreat, the firefighters found they could advance through what felt like a protected passage through the flames. Emma, still leading the hymn, noticed the change in the air around them. The suffocating heat had diminished, replaced by what felt like a protective bubble of cooler air. The 5 younger children, drawing strength from the miracle unfolding around them, sang with renewed vigor, "Be still, my soul, begin the song of praise on earth, believing to thy Lord on high." Chief Stevens, climbing the ladder himself despite his team's protests, felt something he hadn't experienced since the day he lost his daughter: hope. The voices of the children grew louder as he ascended, guiding him through the smoke and flames. The heat that had been unbearable moments before seemed to part before him, creating a path to the window. Inside the room, Emma saw the chief's helmet appear at the window. Their eyes met through the smoke, and in that moment something passed between them, a recognition of faith rewarded, of prayers answered. The chief's face, illuminated by the strange golden light that seemed to fill the room, showed a mixture of awe and determination. "Keep singing, children," Emma encouraged, even as she helped guide Sarah, the youngest, toward the window. "God has sent us our angels." The rescue operation, which had seemed impossible minutes before, suddenly proceeded with miraculous efficiency. One by one, the children were carefully passed through the window to waiting firefighters on the ladder. Through it all, they continued to sing, their voices never wavering. "Be still, my soul, when change and tears are past, all safe and blessed we shall meet at last." As Chief Stevens helped Emma, the last child, onto the ladder, he found himself joining in the final lines of the hymn, his voice rough with emotion. The words that had once brought him only pain now filled him with a sense of healing and purpose. The descent seemed to take place in a bubble of calm, despite the inferno raging around them. The crowd below watched in amazement as the ladder emerged from the smoke, carrying its precious cargo to safety. Many would later describe seeing what appeared to be a brilliant figure of light surrounding the ladder, protecting it from the flames. As Emma's feet touched the ground, a tremendous crash echoed through the night as the third floor of the Evergreen Orphanage collapsed. Yet she never flinched, her faith unshaken. Instead, she turned to Chief Stevens, her small face streaked with soot but her eyes shining with an inner light. "Thank you for not giving up on us," she said softly. "God didn't give up on any of us." Stevens, looking into her eyes, felt the walls he had built around his heart since his daughter's death begin to crumble. The hymn that had guided them to safety continued to echo in his mind, no longer a reminder of loss, but a promise of healing. The night was not over, and the full extent of the miracle that had occurred would take time to understand. But in that moment, as the rescued children were reunited with Miss Clara, and the gathered crowd broke into spontaneous prayer and thanksgiving, something profound had already changed. A hymn of faith had done more than save lives. It had begun to heal wounded hearts and restore lost faith. In the chaos of that extraordinary night, what happened next would be documented by dozens of witnesses, captured on countless cell phones, and recorded by 3 different news crews who had arrived to cover the fire. The events that unfolded would challenge the beliefs of even the most steadfast skeptics and transform a small Colorado town forever. As Emma and the 5 children stood safely on the ground, surrounded by paramedics and concerned onlookers, the night sky above the Evergreen Orphanage suddenly illuminated with an inexplicable brilliance. The golden light that had been glimpsed during their rescue intensified, forming what appeared to be a protective dome over the burning building. Hundreds of witnesses watched in awe as the mysterious radiance seemed to push back against the flames, creating a visible barrier between the fire and the night sky. Channel 7 news reporter Sarah Mitchell, who had been broadcasting live, struggled to maintain her professional composure as she described the scene. I'm not quite sure how to explain what we're seeing right now. The light appears to be emanating from where the children were rescued, creating what looks like... Ladies and gentlemen, I know this sounds incredible, but it looks like an angel's wings spread over the building. Chief Stevens, who had remained close to Emma since the rescue, found himself frozen in place watching as the phenomenon unfolded. The rational part of his mind searched for logical explanations, light refraction, smoke patterns, or some atmospheric anomaly, but in his heart he knew he was witnessing something beyond natural explanation. "Do you see it, Mr. Stevens?" Emma asked softly, her small hand finding his. "The angel who protected us, just like in Daniel's story." The fire chief could only nod, words failing him as he watched the divine manifestation above. The light seemed to pulse with a gentle rhythm, almost like a heartbeat, and where it touched the flames, they appeared to withdraw, as if repelled by its sacred presence. Dr. James Richardson, a meteorologist from the local weather station, had been monitoring the unusual weather patterns created by the fire. His instruments began recording inexplicable data. The temperature in the immediate vicinity dropped by 20 degrees in a matter of seconds, he would later report, and the wind patterns, they completely defied all known atmospheric physics. The gathered crowd watched in stunned silence as the luminous figure became more distinct. Those with phones and cameras captured images that would soon spread across social media and news networks worldwide. The footage showed a clearly defined form, radiant and powerful, hovering protectively over the scene. Miss Clara, who had been praying continuously since the children's rescue, fell to her knees in gratitude. "Praise God," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Praise God for His infinite mercy." Paramedics examining the children made another startling discovery. Despite having been trapped in a burning building for over an hour, surrounded by temperatures that should have caused severe burns and smoke inhalation, all 6 children showed no signs of injury. Their clothes were singed, their faces smudged with soot, but their skin was unmarked, their lungs clear. "This is medically impossible," Dr. Sarah Thompson, the first responder who examined them, stated in her official report. "The conditions they endured, they should have at least suffered first-degree burns and significant respiratory distress. Instead, they're completely unharmed." Emma, still holding the Bible she had kept with her throughout the ordeal, began to share their experience with the gathered emergency personnel. She described the presence they had felt in the room, the mysterious cooling air that had surrounded them, and the peace that had filled their hearts as they sang. "We weren't afraid anymore," she explained, her voice clear and confident. "It was like being wrapped in a warm blanket. Even though there was fire all around us, we could feel that we weren't alone." The other children nodded in agreement, each adding their own observations of the miracle they had experienced. 5-year-old Sarah described seeing beautiful lights dancing around them as they sang. Michael spoke of feeling safe hands supporting him when he had started to feel weak from the smoke. Local news cameras captured the moment when Lucy, one of the youngest children, approached Chief Stevens. "The angel looked just like your daughter," she said innocently, despite having no way of knowing about Sarah Stevens. "She was smiling and helping you climb the ladder to save us." The fire chief staggered slightly at these words, overwhelmed by their implications. The wall of skepticism he had built around his heart since his daughter's death began to crumble completely. The mysterious figure above, the inexplicable protection of the children, and now this innocent revelation, it all pointed to something beyond his understanding, but not beyond his emerging faith. As the night progressed, more inexplicable events were documented. The fire, which had been consuming the historic building with devastating efficiency, began to die down in a pattern that fire experts would later describe as completely unnatural. The flames appeared to retreat from the ground up, as if being gently but firmly pushed back by an unseen force. Professional photographers captured images of what appeared to be multiple luminous figures moving through the smoke, their forms transparent but distinctly human-like. These photos, later analyzed by experts, would be declared genuine and unaltered, though their content would remain unexplainable by conventional means. The golden light continued to manifest for several hours, visible to everyone present and captured by every camera trained on the scene. As dawn approached, it gradually faded, leaving behind an atmosphere of profound peace and wonder. The Evergreen Orphanage, though severely damaged, had not been completely destroyed, another miracle according to structural engineers who examined the building afterward. In the days that followed, as news of the miracle spread, experts from various fields would attempt to explain what had happened that night. Scientists proposed theories about rare atmospheric phenomena, psychologists suggested mass hysteria, and skeptics dismissed the events entirely. But for those who had been present, for those who had witnessed the transformation of tragedy into triumph, there was no doubt about what they had seen. Chief Stevens, standing amid the aftermath of that extraordinary night, found himself permanently changed. The presence he had felt, the inexplicable protection that had allowed him to reach the children, and the mysterious figure that had guided him, it all pointed to a truth he could no longer deny. His daughter's death had closed his heart to faith, but these miracles had reopened it. Emma's simple faith had not only saved 6 lives that night, it had sparked a miracle that would continue to resonate through the community and beyond. The evidence was undeniable, documented by hundreds of witnesses and captured on countless devices. But perhaps the greatest miracle was not the visible manifestation of divine intervention, but the transformation of hearts and minds that had begun that night. As the sun rose over the mountains, casting its first rays on the scene of the miracle, Emma stood with Chief Stevens, their hands still clasped together. "God is still doing miracles," she said softly. "Just like in the Bible stories, we just have to believe." The fire chief looked down at this remarkable child, then up at the dawn sky where the angelic presence had been visible just hours before. "Yes," he replied, his voice thick with emotion, "I believe he is." In the days following the miraculous rescue at the Evergreen Orphanage, the small Colorado town of Pine Valley found itself at the center of international attention. News vans lined the previously quiet streets, and journalists from around the world converged on the mountain community, all seeking to understand and document the inexplicable events that had transpired on that extraordinary night. Dr. Sarah Thompson sat at her desk in Pine Valley Memorial Hospital, reviewing her medical findings for what felt like the 100th time. The clinical data before her defied everything she had learned in her 15 years of emergency medicine. She picked up Emma's file, reading through the results once again. "Patient shows no signs of smoke inhalation, despite prolonged exposure to toxic fumes," she muttered, running her finger along the typed lines. "Normal oxygen saturation levels. No evidence of burns or tissue damage. Core body temperature within normal range despite environmental temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit." The reports for the other 5 children, Michael, Sarah, Tommy, Lucy, and David, showed identical results. It was as if they had spent the evening in a climate-controlled room, rather than being trapped in an inferno for over an hour. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, looking up to see Professor James Morrison from the University of Colorado's Department of Atmospheric Sciences. He carried a thick folder of data and wore an expression of barely contained excitement. "Dr. Thompson," he began, spreading several charts across her desk, "have you seen these readings from the night of the fire? The meteorological data is unlike anything I've encountered in 30 years of research." The professor pointed to a series of graphs showing temperature variations and wind patterns. "Look at this. At exactly 9:47 p.m., the moment witnesses reported seeing the golden light, we recorded a localized temperature drop of 20 degrees in a perfect circle around the orphanage. The wind patterns completely reversed, creating what appears to be a protective vortex around the building." Dr. Thompson nodded, adding these findings to her growing file of unexplainable phenomena. "Professor, how do you explain the children's condition? From a medical perspective, their survival is impossible, let alone their complete lack of injuries." Before Morrison could respond, another knock interrupted them. This time it was Carol Martinez, the lead forensic photographer from the county investigation team. She carried a laptop and several enlarged photographs. "Doctors, you need to see this," she said, setting up her computer. "We've analyzed every photo and video taken that night. Over 300 different devices captured images of the luminous figure. Every single one has been authenticated. No editing, no manipulation, no technical glitches." She pulled up a series of photographs showing the mysterious golden light. When digitally enhanced, the images clearly showed what appeared to be a winged figure hovering above the orphanage. More remarkable were the smaller figures of light that seemed to be moving through the smoke, protecting the children and guiding the firefighters. "The most interesting thing," Carol continued, zooming in on one particular image, "is this." The photograph showed Chief Stevens on the ladder during the rescue, and beside him, barely visible but unmistakable, was the transparent figure of a young girl matching the description of his deceased daughter, Sarah. "There's more," she added, pulling out another set of photographs. "We found this in the rubble." She handed them a partially burned Bible, Emma's Bible. Though the cover was scorched, the pages were intact, and where it had fallen open, the text of Daniel chapter 6 was clearly visible, telling the story of Daniel in the lion's den and the angel sent to protect him. Meanwhile, across town at the Pine Valley Police Station, Chief Stevens was reviewing the official incident reports with Lieutenant Rodriguez. The security camera footage from nearby buildings had captured the entire event, providing irrefutable evidence of the supernatural occurrence. "Play that section again," Stevens requested, pointing to a specific timestamp. The video clearly showed the moment when the golden light appeared, spreading what looked like protective wings over the burning building. The digital timestamp confirmed that this matched exactly with the moment Emma had begun singing the hymn. "Chief," Rodriguez said carefully, "we've had experts from 3 different agencies analyze this footage. No one can explain it. And the thermal imaging camera." He pulled up another video showing the heat signatures from that night. The recording displayed an inexplicable cool zone surrounding the children, despite the inferno raging around them. As they reviewed the evidence, Emma herself was being interviewed by Dr. Rachel Chen, a child psychologist specializing in trauma cases. The session was unlike any the experienced therapist had conducted before. "Emma," Dr. Chen began gently, "can you tell me how you felt when you were in the fire?" The 7-year-old smiled serenely, showing no signs of the trauma that should have followed such a harrowing experience. "I wasn't afraid," she replied simply. "I knew God would send help just like he did for Daniel. The angels were there with us the whole time." "And the other children?" Dr. Chen prompted. "How were they feeling?" "They were scared at first," Emma acknowledged. "But when we started singing and praying, everything changed. It was like being wrapped in a warm hug, even though there was fire everywhere. We could feel that we weren't alone." Dr. Chen made notes, fascinated by the consistency of Emma's account with those of the other children. All 6 described the same sensations, the same protective presence, though each from their unique perspective. As news of these findings spread, the scientific community struggled to provide rational explanations. Dr. Robert Nash, a prominent skeptic and investigator of paranormal claims, arrived in Pine Valley determined to debunk the miracle. However, after 3 days of rigorous investigation, he called a press conference that would stun his colleagues. "In my 30 years of investigating supernatural claims," he announced to the assembled reporters, "I have never encountered anything like this. The evidence is overwhelming and, by any scientific standard, inexplicable. What happened at the Evergreen Orphanage transcends our current understanding of physical laws." The media frenzy intensified as more details emerged. Witnesses came forward with their own photographs and videos, each adding to the growing body of evidence. Social media platforms were flooded with images of the event, and video clips of the mysterious light went viral, garnering millions of views within hours. Yet perhaps the most compelling testimony came from Chief Stevens himself. In a quiet moment between interviews, he sat with Emma on a bench outside the damaged orphanage, both of them gazing at the charred building that had become a symbol of divine intervention. "You know," he said softly, "I saw her too, my Sarah. She was there, helping us on the ladder." Emma nodded, unsurprised. "The angels let her come to help her daddy find his faith again," she replied with the simple wisdom of a child. "God knows what we need, even before we ask." As the sun set on another day of investigation and documentation, the town of Pine Valley had become more than just a site of an inexplicable event. It had become a testament to the reality that some things in life truly are beyond explanation, beyond science, beyond our limited human understanding. The evidence would continue to be studied, debated, and analyzed for years to come. But for those who were there, for those who witnessed the miracle firsthand, no explanation was necessary. They had experienced something that transcended the boundaries of natural law, something that could only be described as divine intervention. And in the midst of it all, Emma's unwavering faith remained a beacon of light, reminding everyone that sometimes the most profound truths are best understood through the eyes of a child who simply believes. The morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of Pine Valley's community church, casting rainbow patterns across the worn wooden pews. The small church, which typically hosted no more than 50 people for Sunday services, was now filled to capacity, with observers spilling out onto the front steps. Chief Mark Stevens sat in the front row, a place he hadn't occupied in over 3 years, since the day of his daughter Sarah's funeral. Beside him sat Emma, her small hand resting comfortingly on his arm. The 7-year-old wore a simple blue dress, her auburn hair neatly tied back with a ribbon. In the week since the miracle at the Evergreen Orphanage, she had become more than just a child he had rescued. She had become the instrument of his own salvation. "I need to share something with all of you," Stevens began, his voice trembling slightly as he stood at the pulpit. The congregation fell silent, dozens of familiar faces looking up at him with anticipation. "Many of you know my story. You were here 3 years ago when I buried my daughter Sarah. You watched as I turned my back on God, on faith, on everything I once held dear." He paused, gathering his strength. Emma's encouraging smile from the front pew gave him the courage to continue. "But what you witnessed at the orphanage wasn't just the miracle of 6 children being saved from an impossible situation. It was also the miracle of a broken man finding his way back to faith." Stevens proceeded to describe that extraordinary night in detail, the desperation he felt as the flames consumed the building, the moment he heard Emma's voice singing through the inferno, and the inexplicable presence that had guided him up the ladder. His voice grew stronger as he spoke of seeing his daughter's spirit, helping to guide him during the rescue. "I had convinced myself that faith was a fairy tale," he continued, his eyes glistening with tears. "I blamed God for taking Sarah from me. But through Emma's unwavering belief, through the miracle we all witnessed, I've learned that Sarah was never really gone. She's been watching over me, waiting for me to open my heart again." In the following days, Stevens's transformation became the talk of the town. The hardened, bitter man who had isolated himself from the community was gone, replaced by someone who radiated a quiet joy and sense of purpose. He began spending his free time at the temporary shelter, housing the orphanage children, sharing meals with them and leading them in prayer. The media, which had initially focused on the supernatural aspects of the rescue, now turned their attention to this story of personal redemption. A reporter from the Denver Post wrote a touching piece titled "Faith Through Fire: A Father's Journey Back to God," which was picked up by national newspapers. One particularly poignant moment came when Stevens decided to visit Sarah's grave for the first time since her funeral. Emma insisted on accompanying him, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself. As they stood before the headstone, Stevens felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. "You know," Emma said softly, arranging the flowers, "she's really proud of you. I saw it in her eyes that night, when she was helping us." Stevens knelt beside her, touching the cold granite of the headstone. "How do you do it, Emma? How do you maintain such strong faith at such a young age?" Emma's response was characteristically simple yet profound. "Because God is real, Mr. Stevens. He's as real as you and me. We just have to open our eyes to see Him working in our lives." The transformation extended beyond Stevens himself. The Pine Valley Fire Department, once known for its strictly professional approach, began incorporating spiritual support into their emergency response protocols. Stevens instituted a chaplaincy program and made sure that every shift started with a moment of prayer. Lieutenant Rodriguez, who had worked alongside Stevens for years, noticed the change in his chief's leadership style. "He's still the same efficient, dedicated firefighter," Rodriguez explained to a local news crew, "but now there's an added dimension. He treats each call as a mission, not just a job. It's like he sees God's purpose in everything we do." The change was perhaps most evident in how Stevens dealt with trauma calls involving children. Where once he would have avoided such situations, triggering painful memories of Sarah, he now approached them with a calm strength, often providing comfort to frightened parents through prayer and reassurance. One such incident occurred when the department responded to a car accident involving a young family. The parents were trapped in the front seat, their 6-year-old daughter crying in the back. Stevens not only coordinated the rescue operation, but also crawled into the wreckage to hold the child's hand, singing "Amazing Grace," the same hymn that had helped save Emma and the others until she calmed down. Emma, meanwhile, had become something of a local celebrity, though she remained remarkably unchanged by the attention. She continued to lead the other orphanage children in daily prayers and Bible studies, now held in the community center that was temporarily housing them. Her simple, unshakable faith continued to touch lives throughout the community. One afternoon, as Stevens was helping to organize donations for the Orphanage Rebuilding Fund, he overheard Emma talking to a group of skeptical reporters. One had asked her why she thought God had chosen to perform such a dramatic miracle. "God didn't do it to show off," she explained patiently. "He did it to remind us that He's always with us, even when things seem impossible." Sometimes we just need to see it with our own eyes to remember what we already know in our hearts. The transformation of Pine Valley itself was remarkable. Church attendance soared, not just at the community church, but at all local places of worship. People began greeting each other with "God bless you" instead of just "hello." Local businesses started displaying Bible verses in their windows, and the town council opened their meetings with prayer. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the community dealt with tragedy and hardship. When a late spring blizzard hit the region, stranding several families in their homes, the response was immediate and coordinated. Stevens organized the rescue operations, but this time the practical efforts were undergirded by a spiritual dimension that brought the community together in a new way. "We're not just neighbors anymore," Stevens explained during a community meeting. "We're a family, united in faith." What happened at the orphanage wasn't just about saving 6 children, it was about God saving all of us from our own doubts and fears. Emma's influence continued to grow, though she remained remarkably humble about her role in the miracle. She spent her days helping to sort through donations for the new orphanage, always taking time to share her faith with anyone who asked. Her simple testimony, "God is real and He loves us," became something of a motto for the town's spiritual revival. As the weeks passed, Stevens found himself looking forward to Sunday services with an eagerness he hadn't felt since childhood. He even began teaching Sunday school, sharing his story with the children and helping them understand that faith could withstand even the strongest fires of adversity. The transformation of Mark Stevens and Pine Valley served as a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest miracles aren't just the supernatural events that capture headlines, but the quiet revolution that takes place in human hearts when faith is renewed and hope is restored. 1 month after the miraculous rescue at the Evergreen Orphanage, the small mountain town of Pine Valley was transformed into a hive of activity. The story of 6 children saved by divine intervention had touched hearts across the nation, and support poured in from all corners of the country. The charred remains of the historic building were now surrounded by construction equipment, marking the beginning of an ambitious rebuilding project that would come to symbolize the community's renewed spirit. Chief Mark Stevens stood at the construction site early one morning, reviewing blueprints with Emma at his side. The plans showed not just a restoration of the original Victorian structure, but an expansion that would include a new chapel, a community center, and gardens designed for reflection and prayer. "What do you think?" he asked Emma, watching as her eyes scanned the detailed drawings. "It's perfect," she replied, her finger tracing the outline of the chapel. "See how the morning sun will shine through these windows, just like the light that protected us that night." The rebuilding project had attracted attention from far beyond Pine Valley's borders. Donations had flooded in after national news coverage of the miracle, but it wasn't just money that arrived. Skilled craftsmen from across the country volunteered their services, many claiming they felt divinely called to help. Architects, carpenters, electricians, and stonemasons worked alongside local volunteers, creating a modern-day barn-raising atmosphere that spoke to the project's spiritual significance. Sarah Mitchell, the Channel 7 reporter who had witnessed the miracle firsthand, returned to document the reconstruction. Her cameras captured the remarkable scene, professionals working alongside volunteers, children helping where they could, and Emma moving through it all like a tiny foreman, offering encouragement and sometimes leading impromptu prayer sessions during lunch breaks. "The spirit here is unlike anything I've ever covered," Sarah reported. "This isn't just about rebuilding a structure. It's about building something that will stand as a testament to faith and community for generations to come." The original Victorian architecture was being carefully preserved and restored, but with modern improvements integrated seamlessly into the design. Fire-resistant materials and state-of-the-art safety systems were incorporated, though, as Emma pointed out with her characteristic wisdom, the best protection comes from above. The new chapel was designed to incorporate elements that commemorated the miracle. The windows would feature stained glass depicting scenes from that night, including the mysterious angelic figure that had been captured in countless photographs. The ceiling would be painted with a mural of guardian angels, a tribute to both the heavenly intervention and Sarah Stevens' spirit watching over her father during the rescue. One morning, as workers were clearing debris from the original structure, they made a remarkable discovery. In what remained of the third-floor common room, they found Emma's Bible, the pages still intact despite the intense heat that had melted metal and turned wood to ash. The book was open to the story of Daniel in the lion's den, the pages unmarked by smoke or fire. "It's another sign," Emma said simply when she saw it, unsurprised by what others viewed as yet another miracle. The Bible was carefully preserved and would eventually be displayed in a special case in the new chapel's entryway. The reconstruction project became a model of interfaith cooperation. Though the new orphanage would maintain its Christian foundation, the community center was designed to welcome people of all faiths. Representatives from various religious traditions contributed to the design, creating spaces that would foster spiritual growth and understanding. Chief Stevens, who had once avoided anything remotely religious, now started each construction day with a prayer circle. Workers of all backgrounds joined hands as he asked for guidance and protection, the simple ceremony becoming as much a part of the daily routine as checking equipment and reviewing plans. The children currently housed in temporary facilities visited the construction site regularly, their excitement growing as they watched their new home take shape. Under Emma's guidance, they created time capsules to be sealed within the walls, filling them with letters, drawings, and prayers for future generations. "We want them to remember," Emma explained to a documentary crew filming the reconstruction, "not just what happened here, but why it happened. God showed us He's real, and we need to share that truth with everyone who comes after us." The rebuilding process wasn't without its challenges. Early winter storms threatened to delay construction, and supply chain issues complicated material deliveries. Yet time and again, just when problems seemed insurmountable, solutions appeared almost miraculously. Local businesses stepped up with needed supplies, volunteer crews worked extra shifts, and the weather seemed to cooperate just when it mattered most. Miss Clara, who had continued to care for the children in their temporary housing, observed these everyday miracles with knowing smile. "The big miracle opened our eyes," she said, "but God keeps showing us His presence in smaller ways if we're willing to see them." The new building was designed with both practical and spiritual purposes in mind. The dormitory spaces were arranged to create family-like units, with common areas that encouraged interaction and support. The library was expanded to include a special collection of books on faith and spiritual growth, while the new music room was equipped with instruments for worship and celebration. Perhaps the most touching aspect of the reconstruction was the memorial garden, designed to honor not only the miracle that had occurred, but also those who had gone before. A special section was dedicated to Sarah Stevens, with a small fountain and bench where visitors could sit and reflect. The garden would become a place of healing for many, including Chief Stevens, who often found peace there during breaks in the construction work. As the weeks passed and the new structure rose from the ashes of the old, the transformation of the physical building paralleled the ongoing transformation of the community. The construction site became a gathering place where barriers broke down and relationships were forged. People who had lived as neighbors for years without really knowing each other found themselves working side by side, sharing stories, prayers, and meals. Emma moved through it all like a small angel herself, her faith touching everyone she encountered. She had a particular gift for knowing just when someone needed encouragement or a reminder of God's presence. Workers spoke of feeling renewed energy after conversations with her, and her prayers often seemed to precede unexpected breakthroughs in the construction process. As autumn turned to winter, the exterior of the new Evergreen Orphanage neared completion. The Victorian facades were restored to their former glory, while modern additions blended seamlessly with the historic architecture. The chapel's spire rose above the town like a beacon, its cross gleaming in the mountain sunlight. The project had become far more than a simple reconstruction. It was a physical manifestation of the community's renewed faith and unity. Every nail driven, every stone laid, every window installed was accompanied by prayer and purpose. The building would stand as a testament not just to the miracle that had occurred, but to the enduring power of faith to transform lives and communities. Chief Stevens, standing with Emma on the newly completed front steps, surveyed their work with quiet satisfaction. "So you know," he said softly, "when we lost Sarah, I thought I'd never find purpose again, but God had other plans." Emma smiled up at him, her faith as unwavering as ever. "He always does, Mr. Stevens. He always does." The reconstruction of the Evergreen Orphanage was nearing its end, but in many ways it marked just the beginning. The building would stand as a symbol of hope and renewal, a place where future generations would learn about the night when heaven touched earth and faith proved stronger than fire. On a bright spring morning, exactly 1 year after the miraculous events that had transformed Pine Valley forever, crowds gathered outside the newly completed Evergreen Orphanage. The Victorian building stood proudly against the backdrop of snow-capped mountains, its restored facade gleaming in the morning sunlight. The chapel spire reached toward the heavens, its cross catching the light like a beacon of hope. Emma, now 8 years old, stood at the front of the gathering, her small hand clasped in Chief Mark Stevens. She wore a blue dress similar to the one she had worn on that fateful night, and her faith-filled eyes sparkled with the same unwavering light that had guided them through the flames. "Welcome," Stevens began, addressing the assembled crowd that included not only local residents, but visitors from across the country who had been touched by their story. "1 year ago, God showed us that miracles still happen. Today we dedicate this building, not just as a home for children in need, but as a testament to His enduring grace." The new Evergreen Orphanage was more than just a reconstruction of what had been lost. It stood as a symbol of transformation, both physical and spiritual. The main entrance opened into a grand foyer, where Emma's preserved Bible was displayed in a custom-made case, open to the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Beside it, photographs and news articles documented the miracle that had occurred, including authenticated images of the angelic presence that had protected the children. The chapel, with its stunning stained glass windows depicting scenes from that extraordinary night, had become a place of pilgrimage. The window behind the altar showed the moment when divine light had penetrated the flames, with the figure of Sarah Stevens barely visible among the angels, eternally watching over her father and the children he had saved. "This building," Emma addressed the crowd in her clear young voice, "is more than just our home. It's a reminder that God is still working miracles today. He sent angels to protect us in the fire, just like He protected Daniel, and He keeps watching over us every day." The dedication ceremony proceeded with a series of testimonials from those who had witnessed the miracle and been part of the reconstruction. Miss Clara spoke of the children's unwavering faith during their time in temporary housing. Lieutenant Rodriguez described how the fire department had been transformed by the experience. Local builders shared stories of unexplainable assistance during the reconstruction, tools appearing just when needed, weather clearing precisely when it mattered most. The 5 children who had been with Emma that night, Michael, Sarah, Tommy, Lucy, and David, stood together as a choir singing Amazing Grace, the hymn that had become synonymous with their rescue. Their voices, pure and strong, carried the same faith that had sustained them through the flames. As part of the ceremony, Chief Stevens unveiled a special memorial in the garden. A life-sized bronze statue depicted a firefighter being guided by an angel, its features deliberately reminiscent of both Sarah Stevens and the mysterious figure captured in photographs during the rescue. The inscription read, "For where faith leads, miracles follow." "My daughter Sarah's death nearly destroyed my faith," Stevens shared, his voice thick with emotion. "But through Emma's extraordinary belief and God's incredible grace, I found it again. Sarah never really left us. She became part of the miracle that brought us all back to God." The new Evergreen Orphanage had already begun to fulfill its expanded mission. Beyond providing a home for children in need, it had become a center for spiritual renewal. The community center hosted interfaith dialogues, prayer groups, and support meetings for those struggling with their faith. The memorial garden had become a place of healing for grieving parents, with many reporting a sense of peace and divine presence similar to what had been experienced during the miracle. Emma had naturally assumed a special role in the orphanage's ministry. Despite her young age, her simple yet profound faith continued to touch lives. She led daily prayer meetings with the other children, welcomed visitors seeking to understand the miracle, and maintained a quiet confidence that inspired everyone she met. "God's love is simple," she would often say to visitors. "We're the ones who make it complicated. Sometimes He has to remind us in big ways, like He did with the fire, but He's always here, always watching, always caring." The impact of the miracle extended far beyond Pine Valley. Documentary films, books, and news articles continued to tell the story of the night when heaven touched earth. Scientists still studied the inexplicable data recorded during the event, while skeptics found their doubts challenged by the overwhelming evidence and countless witnesses. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the change in individual lives. The transformation of Mark Stevens from a bitter, faithless man to a beacon of hope and guidance inspired others who had lost their way. The fire department's chaplaincy program became a model for other emergency services, recognizing the importance of spiritual support alongside physical rescue. Regular visitors to the orphanage often reported unusual experiences, glimpses of light similar to what had been seen during the miracle, unexplained feelings of peace, and sometimes even the faint sound of angels singing. While these occurrences were never as dramatic as the original miracle, they served as gentle reminders of the continuing divine presence. The children who had been part of the miracle remained remarkably well adjusted, showing none of the trauma that might have been expected from their experience. They spoke of that night not with fear but with joy, each maintaining that they had felt completely safe in the midst of the flames, protected by angels they could still sometimes sense around them. As the dedication ceremony drew to a close, Emma led the assembled crowd in a prayer of thanksgiving. Her words, simple yet profound, captured the essence of what the new Evergreen Orphanage represented. Dear God, thank you for showing us that you're real, that you still do miracles, and that you never leave us alone. Thank you for sending angels to protect us, for bringing Mr. Stevens back to you, and for giving us this beautiful new home. Help us always remember that with faith, nothing is impossible. Amen. The legacy of the Evergreen Orphanage miracle continued to unfold in ways both grand and subtle. Each child who found a home there, each visitor who found renewal in the chapel, each person who discovered hope in the memorial garden became part of an ongoing story of faith and divine intervention. Chief Stevens, standing beside Emma as the crowds began to disperse, looked down at the little girl who had helped him rediscover his faith. "You know," he said softly, "Sarah would have loved this place." Emma smiled up at him, her eyes twinkling with their characteristic wisdom. "She does love it, Mr. Stevens. She's still here, watching over all of us. The angels never really leave. We just have to keep our hearts open to see them." As the sun set on that memorable day, its rays catching the chapel's cross and casting long shadows in the memorial garden, the Evergreen Orphanage stood as a testament to an eternal truth, that in a world often darkened by doubt and despair, faith still has the power to light the way, and miracles still happen to those who believe. The legacy of that extraordinary night would continue to touch lives for generations to come, reminding all who heard the story that sometimes the greatest miracles aren't just the dramatic moments of divine intervention, but the lasting transformation of hearts and lives that follow when faith finds its way home. After witnessing this extraordinary story of faith, miracles and transformation at the Evergreen Orphanage, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Has faith ever helped you through an impossible situation? Have you ever experienced something that couldn't be explained? Share your story in the comments below and let us know what touched your heart most about Emma and Chief Stevens' journey. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.